Most gardeners are starving their tomatoes while thinking they're feeding them. They dump on fast nitrogen fertilizers, compost teas, or bottled nutrients, and then wonder why the plants explode with leafy growth but stall on fruit production, struggle with disease, or burn through soil fertility halfway through the season. The real problem isn't that tomatoes need more nutrients. It's that they need slower, steadier biological nutrition, especially nitrogen that's tied to soil life rather than dumped directly into the root zone. And one of the most effective ways I've found to create that system is something most gardeners have never tried: fermenting wool with molasses. Let's talk about why wool is actually one of the best slow nitrogen sources you can put into a tomato system. Now let's talk about how this actually gets used with tomatoes in the garden. In a typical backyard bed, I'll dig a shallow trench around each tomato plant about 6 inches away from the main stem. Tomatoes send feeder roots outward, so feeding that outer zone works far better than dumping nutrients right at the base. From that 1-gallon fermentation bucket, I'll take about 1 cup of the fermented liquid and dilute it into a watering can, holding roughly 1 gallon of water. That dilution prevents overfeeding while still delivering microbes and nutrients. The softened wool itself gets buried directly in that trench before watering. A small clump per plant is enough. Once covered with soil, it slowly decomposes over the next several months. What you end up with is a long-term nitrogen battery in the root zone. Instead of spiking nutrients for a week and then crashing, the plant receives a steady supply through microbial breakdown. I first tested this method in raised beds where tomatoes had been struggling with mid-season yellowing despite regular compost applications. Within about 2 weeks of applying fermented wool, the plants darkened up noticeably. Not the overly lush, floppy green you get from synthetic nitrogen, but a deeper, healthier leaf color. Fruit set improved too. That's something a lot of gardeners miss. Balanced nitrogen actually helps fruit production. Excess nitrogen suppresses fruiting, but steady microbial nitrogen supports both foliage and flowering. Raised beds especially benefit from this because they lose nutrients faster than in-ground soil. The wool acts like a slow-release sponge, holding both nitrogen and moisture around the roots. Now, if you're growing tomatoes hydroponically, you obviously can't bury wool in your system, but the fermentation liquid itself can still be useful if you understand its role. In hydroponics, I use fermented wool tea more like a microbial inoculant than a primary nutrient. The liquid gets filtered through cloth and then diluted heavily, usually 1 part tea to 20 parts water, before being added to a reservoir that already has balanced hydroponic nutrients. What this does is introduce beneficial microbial life that can stabilize the root zone and help prevent certain root pathogens. I've tested it in Dutch bucket systems and passive hydro setups with good results, especially when temperatures get warm and roots become vulnerable. And it's not replacing hydro nutrients, but it adds a biological dimension most sterile systems lack. One thing that surprises gardeners the first time they try this method is how well it holds moisture. Wool fibers can absorb huge amounts of water relative to their weight. Once buried in soil, they act almost like a reservoir. In dry climates or hot summers, that can be a serious advantage. Tomatoes hate inconsistent watering. When the soil swings between dry and saturated, you start seeing blossom end rot, fruit cracking, and poor nutrient uptake. The wool moderates those swings. It holds moisture during irrigation and releases it slowly as the soil dries. Now let's address a common criticism: smell. People assume fermenting wool will stink like rotting garbage. In reality, if the fermentation is balanced with molasses and oxygen exposure during stirring, the smell stays earthy and slightly sweet. If it smells like sewage, it usually means the mixture went completely anaerobic. Stirring once a day during the fermentation period prevents that. Another question I get constantly is whether wool attracts pests. In my experience, buried wool does the opposite. Once it's underground and partially decomposed, it's just organic matter. I've never seen rodents dig for it the way they might with food scraps or seed meals. What I have seen is dramatically improved soil structure after a season. The fibers break down slowly and create tiny channels in the soil, improving aeration and root penetration. One of the biggest mistakes gardeners make with tomatoes is focusing only on feeding the plant instead of building the soil ecosystem that feeds the plant automatically. Fermented wool shifts the focus in the right direction. You're not just adding nitrogen, you're introducing microbial life, slow-release fertility, moisture retention, and organic matter all at once. That combination is why the results tend to show up quickly, but also last the entire season. I've now used this approach in ground beds, raised beds, container tomatoes, and hydroponic experiments. The consistency of the response is what convinced me it wasn't just a one-off trick. The plants grow stronger root systems, hold deeper leaf color without becoming overly vegetative, and maintain fruit production longer into the season. And honestly, the materials are about as low-tech as it gets. Wool that would otherwise be discarded, a little molasses, water, and time into, if you're serious about growing better tomatoes, these kinds of biological shortcuts are where the real gains happen. Not in the latest fertilizer product on a garden center shelf. That's exactly the kind of practical experimentation we focus on here at Gentle Herb Gardening. Real techniques tested in real gardens that actually move the needle on food production. So if you enjoy digging into methods like this and want to keep improving how you grow your food, make sure you subscribe to Gentle Herb Gardening and share this video with another gardener who's serious about getting better results. The more we share practical knowledge like this, the better food we all grow.